Part 2. Posing the Problem. The foregoing comments lead us to reflect, in the light of the Word of the Lord, on the complex process of liberation which we have attempted to sketch. That is to say, they lead us to a theology of liberation. This reflection must be rooted in the presence and actions of Christians, in solidarity with others, in the world today, especially as participants in the process of liberation which is being effected in Latin America. But first we will attempt to state the problem we are considering as precisely as possible. Throughout the life of the Church, this problem has received different responses which are still in one way or another significant, because of the part they play in the concrete activity of many Christians. An analysis of these responses can therefore help us to understand the features which currently characterize the problem. Chapter 3. The Problem. To speak about a theology of liberation is to seek an answer to the following question. What relation is there between salvation and the historical process of human liberation? In other words, we must attempt to discern the interrelationship among the different meanings of the term liberation which we indicated above. The scope of the problem will be clarified in the course of this work, but it might be helpful to point out at this stage some of its fundamental features. The question is essentially traditional. Theological reflection has always at least implicitly addressed itself to it. In recent years, the theology of temporal realities, an expression which was never fully accepted, attempted to deal with it in its own way. Other attempts have been the theology of history and, more recently, the theology of development. From another viewpoint, the question is also considered by political theology, and it is partially treated by the much debated and debatable theology of revolution. We are dealing here with the classic question of the relation between faith and human existence, between faith and social reality, between faith and political action, or in other words, between the kingdom of God and the building up of the world. Within the scope of this problem, the classical theme of the church-society or church-world relationship is also considered. Its perennial quality, however, must not make us forget the new aspects which the traditional question takes on today. Under new forms, it maintains all its topicality. J.B. Metz asserted recently that, despite the many discussions about the Church and the world, there is nothing more unclear than the nature of their relationship to one another. But if this is so, if the problem continues to be current and yet the attempted responses are not wholly satisfactory, it is perhaps because, as traditionally stated, the problem has become tangential to a new and changing reality. As traditionally stated, the problem does not go deep enough. In studying these questions, the texts, and especially the spirit of Vatican II, are undoubtedly necessary as points of reference. Nevertheless, the new design of the problem was, and could only be, partially present in the conciliar documents. It seems to me of utmost importance, said Karl Rahner recently, to agree on the fact that the ideas explicitly considered during Vatican Council II do not actually represent the central problems of the post-conciliar Church. It is not enough to say that Christians should not shirk their earthly responsibilities, or that these have a certain relationship to salvation. Gaudium et Spes itself sometimes gives the impression of remaining at this level of generalization. More regrettably, the same is true of a considerable number of commentators. The task of contemporary theology is to elucidate the current state of these problems, drawing with sharper lines the terms in which they are expressed. Only thus will it be possible to confront the concrete challenges of the present. In the current statement of the problem, one fact is evident. The social praxis of contemporary humankind has begun to reach maturity. It is the behavior of a humankind ever more conscious of being an active subject of history, ever more articulate in the face of social injustice and of all repressive forces which stand in the way of its fulfillment. It is ever more determined to participate both in the transformation of social structures and in effective political action. It was above all the great social revolutions, the French and the Russian, for example, to mention only two important milestones, together with the whole process of revolutionary ferment that they initiated, which wrested, or at least began to, political decisions from the hands of an elite who were destined to rule. Up to that time, the great majority of people did not participate in political decisions, or did so only sporadically and formally. Although it is true that the majority of people are far from this level of awareness, it is also certain that they have had confused glimpses of it, and are oriented in its direction. The phenomenon that we designate with the term politicization, which is increasing in breadth and depth in Latin America, is one of the manifestations of this complex process. And in the struggle for the liberation of the oppressed classes on this continent, which is implicit in the effective and human political responsibility of all, people are searching out new paths. Human reason has become political reason. For the contemporary historical consciousness, things political are not only those which one attends to during the free time afforded by one's private life, nor are they even a well-defined area of human existence. The construction, from its economic bases, of the poles of a society in which people can live in solidarity, is a dimension which encompasses and severely conditions all human activity. It is the sphere for the existence of a critical freedom, which is won down through history. It is the universal determinant and the collective arena for human fulfillment. Only within this broad meaning of the political sphere can we situate the more precise notion of politics as an orientation to power. For Max Weber, this orientation constitutes the typical characteristics of political activity. The concrete forms taken on by this quest for and exercise of political power are varied, but they are all based on the profound aspiration of a humankind that wants to take hold of the reins of its own life and be the artisan of its own destiny. Nothing lies outside the political sphere understood in this way. Everything has a political color. It is always in the political fabric, and never outside of it, that a person emerges as a free and responsible being, as a person in relationship with other persons, as someone who takes on a historical task. Personal relationships themselves acquire an ever-increasing political dimension. Persons enter into relationships among themselves through political means. This is what Ricoeur calls the lasting and stable relationships of the socius, as opposed to the fleeting and fragile relationships of the neighbor. To this effect, M.D. Chenu writes, "Man has always enjoyed this social dimension, since he is social by his very nature. But today, not accidentally but structurally, the collective event lends scope and intensity to the social dimension. What is collective as such has human value, and is, therefore, a means and object of love. Human love treads these lasting paths, these organizations of distributive justice, and these administrative systems." In addition to this universality of the political sphere, we are faced with an increasing radicalization of social praxis. Contemporary persons have begun to lose their naivete as they confront economic and socio-cultural determinants. The deep causes of the situation in which they find themselves are becoming clearer. They realize that to attack these deep causes is the indispensable prerequisite for radical change, and so they have gradually abandoned a simple reformist attitude regarding the existing social order, for, by its very shallowness, this reformism perpetuates the existing system. The revolutionary situation which prevails today, especially in the Third World, is an expression of this growing radicalization. To support the social revolution means to abolish the present status quo and to attempt to replace it with a qualitatively different one. It means to build a just society based on new relationships of production. It means to attempt to put an end to the domination of some countries by others, of some social classes by others, of some persons by others. The liberation of these countries, social classes, and persons undermines the very foundation of the present order. It is the greatest challenge of our time. This radicality has led us to see quite clearly that the political arena is necessarily conflictual. More precisely, the building of a just society means the confrontation, in which different kinds of violence are present, between groups with different interests and opinions. The building of a just society means overcoming every obstacle to the creation of authentic peace. Concretely, in Latin America, this conflict revolves around the oppression-liberation axis. Social praxis makes demands which may seem difficult or disturbing to those who wish to achieve or maintain a low-cost conciliation. Such a conciliation can be only a justifying ideology for a profound disorder, a device for the few to keep living off the poverty of the many. But to become aware of the conflictual nature of the political sphere should not mean to become complacent. On the contrary, it should mean struggling, with clarity and courage, deceiving neither oneself nor others, for the establishment of peace and justice among all people. In the past, concern for social praxis and theological thought did not sufficiently take into account the political dimension. In Christian circles, there was and continues to be difficulty in perceiving the originality and specificity of the political sphere. Stress was placed on private life and on the cultivation of private values. Things political were relegated to a lower plane, to the elusive and undemanding area of a misunderstood common good. At most, this viewpoint provided a basis for social pastoral planning, grounded on the social emotion, which every self-respecting Christian ought to experience. Hence there developed the complacency with a very general and humanizing vision of reality, to the detriment of a scientific and structural knowledge of socioeconomic mechanisms and historical dynamics. Hence also there came the insistence on the personal and conciliatory aspects of the gospel message rather than on its political and conflictual dimensions. We must take a new look at Christian life. We must see how these emphases in the past have conditioned and challenged the historical presence of the Church. This presence has an inescapable political dimension. It has always been so, but because of new circumstances, it is more urgent that we come to terms with it. Indeed, there is a greater awareness of it, even among Christians. It is impossible to think of or live in the Church without taking into account this political dimension. What we have discussed above leads us to understand why, for Christians, social praxis is becoming less and less merely a duty imposed by their moral conscience or a reaction to an attack on church interests. The characteristics of totality, radicalness, and conflict which we have attributed to the political sphere preclude any compartmentalized approach and lead us to see its deepest human dimensions. Social praxis is gradually becoming more of the arena itself in which the Christians work out, along with others, both their destiny as humans and their life of faith in the Lord of history. Participation in the process of liberation is an obligatory and privileged locus for Christian life and reflection. In this participation will be heard nuances of the Word of God which are imperceptible in other existential situations, and without which there can be no authentic and fruitful faithfulness to the Lord. If we look more deeply into the question of the value of salvation, which emerges from our understanding of history, that is, a liberating praxis, we see that at issue is a question concerning the very meaning of Christianity. To be a Christian is to accept and to live, in solidarity, in faith, hope, and charity, the meaning that the word of the Lord and our encounter with that word give to the historical becoming of humankind on the way toward total communion. To regard the unique and absolute relationship with God as the horizon of every human action is to place oneself from the outset in a wider and more profound context. It is likewise more demanding. We are faced in our day with the bare, central, theologico-pastoral question. What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a church in the unknown circumstances of the future? In the last instance, we must search the gospel message for the answer to what, according to Camus, constitutes the most important question facing all persons, to decide whether life deserves to be lived or not. These elements lend perhaps greater depth and a new dimension to the traditional problem. Not to acknowledge the newness of the issues raised under the pretext that in one way or another the problem has always been present is to detach oneself dangerously from reality. It is to risk falling into generalities, solutions without commitment, and, finally, evasive attitudes. But, on the other hand, to acknowledge nothing but the new aspects of the contemporary statement of the problem is to forgo the contribution of the life and reflection of the Christian community in its historical pilgrimage. Its successes, its omissions, and its errors are our heritage. They should not, however, delimit our boundaries. The people of God march on, accounting for their hope toward a new heaven and a new earth. The question, as it is posed today, is not really dealt with by the attempted responses we will look at in the next chapter, but the positive achievements of these efforts with regard to the permanent elements of the problem as well as their deficiencies and limitations can help us sketch, often by showing us pitfalls to avoid, the itinerary we must follow.